Hello. I'm Sally, your host. Welcome back to the third board, my Masters Chess channel. In this video, I will show you the conclusion of the game played between Szymon Winawer and Siegbert Tarrasch in Dresden, 1892. If you have not watched part 1, I recommend you watch it first, by clicking the link above. If your device does not show the link, you can access part 1, through links my master made available in this video description, and in the comments section. And now without more delay, let's continue the game. Dear viewer, as we watched in part 1, in this position, Szymon Winawer had white and played. Bishop takes on f4. Sacrificing his bishop in order to open the position. Dr. Tarrasch responds with g takes on f4. Winawer continues with knight takes on f4. A very natural move, but according to Stockfish, it was a weak move. The knight in f4 is limited in targets. And because he was defending the d4 pawn, this move also weakens d4. According to the engine, instead of this move, it was better for white to continue by playing rook to h4. This move not only attacks the bishop, but also transfers the rook to the f-file. One possible continuation suggested by the engine is bishop takes on f3. Queen takes on f3. Bishop to f6. Rook takes on f4. Queen to g7. Queen to h3. Rook from a to d8. c3. Bishop to g5. Rook to f3. And black would still be better, but not by much. Let's return to the original position. After knight takes pawn, the best response for black is c5. And after that, Stockfish suggests the following line: c3. Bishop takes on f3. G takes on f3. C takes on d4. C takes on d4. Knight to c6. d5. Knight to d4. Queen to e3. Knight takes on b3. And black's position would be much better. Let's return to the game. However, after knight takes on f4, Dr. Tarrasch chooses another path. His move is not the best one, but also keeps black in a superior position. Black plays bishop takes on f3. In his book, Dr. Tarrasch says this exchange strengthens white's center, but was a very necessary move. If black allowed white to play knight to h2 unpunished, the g5 bishop could be trapped. Also, it was important to eliminate the f3 knight, otherwise, it could go to e5 and become a dangerous attacker. And the game continues. G takes on f3. Rook from a to d8. Pawn to c5 was better according to Master Fish. Dr. Tarrasch now starts an interesting maneuver to trade his knight by white's strong light square bishop. Black now threatens to play knight to c5, since the d4 pawn is pinned. Winawer plays queen to e3. If instead, queen to c4, then we could have knight to b6. Queen to e2. Bishop takes on d4 check. And black would be much better. Let's return to the original position. Queen to e3 cancels the pin, but it still allows knight to c5. Black plays knight to c5, threatening both the d4 pawn and the bishop on b3. Of course, if the d pawn takes the knight, then bishop to d4 pins the queen. Nevertheless, Stockfish insists pawn to c5 was a better move for black. White continues with c3. Knight takes on b3. And with this maneuver, Dr. Tarrasch eliminates white's important bishop. Winawer continues with pawn takes knight. According to Stockfish, in this position it is better for black to play bishop to f6, with bishop to g5 later, or king to h8, preventing attacks on the king through the g file. If black played bishop to f6, the game could have continued this way. Knight to d3. Rook from d to e8. Threatening knight to d5. King to f2. To bring the rook to the g file. Bishop to g5. f4. Knight to d5. Queen to f3. Rook takes on e4. F takes on g5. Rook to e3. Queen takes on e3. Knight takes queen. King takes knight. And black's position would be much better. Let's return to the original position. If black played king to h8, we could have king to f2, bishop to f6, knight to g6 check, f takes on g6, h takes on g6, knight takes on g6, rook takes on h6, bishop to h4 check, king to g1. If instead, white played king to e2, then black's response would be knight to f4. And if white played king to f1, then black would play rook takes on f3 check, winning. After king to g1, this variation continues with rook to d7. Rook takes on h7. Rook takes rook. And here too, black's position would be better according to the wise fish. Let's return to the game. In this position, Dr. Tarrasch plays pawn to a6. Defending his a6 pawn, and avoiding white's counterplay on the queen's rook file. Master Fish says black's position is still superior, but now his advantage is reduced. Dr. Tarrasch, in his own annotations, however, is not so optimistic. Quote, "White has 2 pawns for the bishop, but these 2 pawns occupy the center and have terribly cramping effect on black's position. In addition, the black queen is locked in, and the other black pieces have very little scope. Thus black is forced into completely passive defense." End quote. And the game continues. Rook to h2. Rook from f to e8. Knight to e2. Winawer's plan is to use the g file, and advance the f pawn. Master Fish, however, recommends knight to d3, avoiding c5. Both players now started relocating their knights. Winawer wishes to transfer his to f5, via g3. Dr. Tarrasch will try to avoid white's pawn to f4, by moving his knight to e6, and then g5. Black plays knight to d5. Making use of the e4 pawn pin, in order to move his knight to c7. The engine insists that pawn to c5 was better. Queen to f2. Knight to c7. Knight to g3. Knight to e6. Black threatens, knight takes on d4. White responds with knight to f5. Defending the pawn. Knight to g5. This move closes the g file, and prevents the f pawn advance by putting pressure on e4. King to h1. King to h8. Rook to g2. Bishop to f6. Knight to e3. Now white threatens to advance his e-pawn, and after that, his f-pawn. Black replies with knight to e6. Opening space for the bishop. If white played e5 now, black would respond with bishop to g5, and knight to f4. Winawer continues with rook to g4. Reinforces the f4 square. White once again threatens to play e5 and f4. Dr. Tarrasch plays bishop to g5. Preparing knight to f4, and threatening to take the e3 knight. Knight to f5. White does not allow his knight to be captured, but the center pawn's advance is delayed. Black continues with rook to g8. Instead of this, it was better for black to play knight to g7, in order to eliminate the strong knight on f5. One possible continuation is knight takes on g7. Queen takes on g7. Rook to a5. Queen to f6. b4. Queen to e7. and black's position would be much better. Let's return to the game. After rook to g8, the game continues with queen to h2. White's plan is to move his queen to e5. However, both Dr. Tarrasch and Stockfish consider that pawn to f4 was better. The game could have continued like this. Bishop to f6. Rook from a to g1. Rook takes on g4. Rook takes on g4. Knight to g7. Knight to g3. Rook to g8. Queen to f3. Bishop to d8. f5. And black would still be better, but not by much. Let's return to the game. After queen to h2, the game continues. Bishop to f6. Rook from a to g1. White doubles his rooks on the g file. Rook to g5. Blocking the g file again, and possibly doubling rooks. White should not take this rook, otherwise, he would lose control over the f4 square. Notice how weak are White's dark squares. Winawer plays f4. To expel this annoying black rook from g5. This move, however, was a mistake. And here we come to another interesting position of the game. How should black play now? I must say that after black's next move, which is not very difficult to find, White's position will crumble. If you wish to study this position, pause the video now. In 1892, Dr. Tarrasch played rook takes on f5. By sacrificing the exchange, black eliminates White's best piece, gains a pawn, maybe two, and activates his queen. The game continues. E takes on f5. Queen takes on f5. And the black queen, which was confined to the corner, now returns to the game, thirsty for blood. But before we continue, I must return this game a little, to move 33, before White played pawn to f4. Stockfish predicted the implications of pawn to f4, and instead of this move, he suggested for White, queen to h3. That would prevent the exchange sacrifice on f5, and possibly save the game. Black's position would still be better though. Well, it is too late now. Let's continue the game. After queen takes on f5, White plays rook from 1 to g2. Possibly preparing to move to f2, from where it could defend the f4 pawn. It also frees the g4 rook to move. But, queen to h3 was better, according to the engine. Knight to g7. Now black wants to relocate his knight to f5. It also puts pressure on the h5 pawn. However, the engine recommends rook to d5 as a stronger move. One possible continuation is queen to h3. Knight takes on f4. Rook to g8 check. King to h7. Queen takes queen check. Rook takes queen. And black's advantage would be overwhelming. Let's return to the game. After knight to g7, the game continues. Rook from 4 to g3. The h5 pawn is poisoned now. If black played, queen takes on h5, or knight takes on h5, white would respond with rook to h3. Black plays queen to b1 check. If instead, black played queen takes on f4, it would have allowed white some counterplay. We could have rook to f2, queen to d6, rook from g to f3, queen takes queen check, rook takes queen, knight to e8. But black would still be much better. Let's return to the original position. If black played queen to d5, the best move according to Stockfish, we could have queen to h3, knight to f5. Knight takes on h5 would be a disaster because rook to g4, king to h7, c4, queen to f5, and rook to g7 check, equalizing the game. Let's return to the variation. After knight to f5, we could have rook to g4, queen to e4. Black now threatens knight to e3, forking both rooks. b4. The fork is unavoidable. Knight to e3. And black's advantage would be overwhelming. Let's return to the game. As the game was approaching the 40th move, both players now repeated their moves in order to trigger the additional time. The game continues with rook to g1, queen to e4 check, rook from 1 to g2, queen to b1 check, knight to f5, followed by knight to e3, would win the game. But Dr. Tarrasch decided to repeat his moves. Rook to g1, queen to e4 check, rook from 3 to g2. Queen to g2 would be better, but it would not save the game either. Black continues with rook to d5. Threatening rook takes on h5, with decisive effect. I quote Dr. Tarrasch, now very optimistic about his position. The counterattack is much easier than the attack, since the attacker often throws caution to the wind, and recklessly lays his position bare, and thus makes it indefensible. End quote. Winawer continues with f5. Rook takes on f5. The game is already lost for white. Queen to b8 check. King to h7. Rook to d1. Dear viewer, Observe carefully this position. Stockfish 14 says that after rook to d1, there is a checkmate in 12 moves for black. I do not think Dr. Tarrasch or Szymon Winawer calculated 12 moves deep. It is not impossible with plenty of time, but still, it is very difficult for any human player to do so. I wanted to show this mate in 12 here, but my master thought it was not necessary. Anyway, the game continues. Rook takes on h5 check. King to g1. Queen to e3 check. Rook to f2. Bishop to h4. And in this position, the Polish master Szymon Winawer resigned. Did you like this game? I hope you enjoyed this video. Please support our channel by liking and subscribing. It will help us a lot. My master and I wish you good luck in your chess. See you next time. Goodbye.